Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I am Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 Advisory Group. We are a consortium of about 75 or so organizations in Massachusetts planning commemorations of the beginnings of American independence. And our guest today is Christina Carrick. And Christina Carrick is the assistant editor of the Papers of Thomas Jefferson. Previously, she was assistant editor of the Robert Paine papers at the Mass Historical Society. And she is at work on a book on the benefits of banishment, the lasting influence of loyalist merchant networks in the early American Republic, or the Loyalists. And so, Christina, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And one of the things you argue and kind of show in your work is that the Loyalists aren't completely banished. They maintain these connections, which are really important to the development of the early America. Can you tell us a little bit more about who they are and what they're doing?
So the people I've been looking at in particular are mainly merchants, but these are people who were essentially exiled, although sometimes they kind of make the excuse that they were voluntarily going on business trips, right, in 1775 and 1776. But a great many of these people were officially banished and were not allowed to return home. But almost everyone I looked at had family or close friends that remained in Boston and in Massachusetts. And so they kept in close correspondence with their family members. So they're kind of creating this, I'm not going to call it a diaspora yet at that point, but a little bit of a correspondence network between wherever they were exiled. In the case of the people I look at, primarily England and the Caribbean, and back home in Boston. And so they're trying to keep their properties together back in Massachusetts, keep in touch with family members. A lot of the time, these people left behind wives, mothers, or daughters that were a little bit more able to stay because they were women. And I'm not going to say by any means that women were not political, but they could be perceived as a little bit safer to remain in Massachusetts while their male relatives went abroad. And so the people I'm looking at either kept in close correspondence with these people after the war ended, or in many cases, they returned to Massachusetts, but kept in touch with the people that they met while they were in exile, which is a whole story of its own.
Right. One of the people you really focus on is David Green, who goes to Antigua and all. Can you tell us a little bit more about who he is and what drew you to him and what else we can learn?
So David Green was a young merchant in Boston at the beginning of the Revolution. He was in his mid-20s, I think. I can't remember his exact birthday, but he was pegged as a loyalist because he supported Thomas Gage and Thomas Hutchinson at the onset of the Revolution. So he went on a business trip to England in 1775. And while he was there, he joined a group of other primarily New England exiled merchants or political figures that were also in London. And they formed a little club that they started off calling the New England Club, but eventually just took on the name of the Loyalist Club and took that on as part of their identity while they were there. And so he stayed there for a few years before he met a merchant from Antigua through their connection to this shared British merchant firm. And he moved to Antigua with the merchant that he met there.
Okay.
Marrying his daughter, lived in Antigua for the rest of the war, and then returned to New England in 1782.
So he returns to New England after this business trip to England in 1775 when a lot of things are happening, and then goes to the West Indies, but then he's able to come back.
First, he came back to Connecticut in 1782, but he was not allowed to go to Boston. He was still officially banished, and it took him a couple more years to actually be able to go back home.
Wow.
And another few years to be able to be a citizen of Massachusetts officially, which was very important to him.
What's the process of appealing your banishment?
So you did have to have personal connections most of the time. And for him, his mother had returned to Boston, and he had several half-brothers and then a few other friends who were in the merchant community there. And so he would write letters to them, but he also formally petitioned the Massachusetts General Court. He sent a couple of petitions first to be given residency, which was kind of, he'd be allowed to be back, but he wouldn't be considered a voting citizen or have the full rights of a citizen. So after a few petitions, the general court granted him that ability. And then he had to go live peacefully in Massachusetts for an additional 3 years before he sent more petitions through his direct connections and friends to the general court again. And they granted him citizenship in, I believe, 1787.
And then does he leave again or does he stay? Do you know?
He stays after that. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think he went to Rhode Island a few times, but he never left the country again. But he did build up a very flourishing trade, and his father-in-law, John Rose, remained in the Caribbean, and so they kept up a close connection and ended up engaging in trade with each other after he settled down in New England.
Interesting.
He achieved that connection by marriage when he was in the Caribbean, in addition to having all the friends that he left abroad that were other loyalists or other friends.
Interesting. And you also mentioned, I know in some of your work, that George Irving, who was the Jefferson administration's consul in London, actually was another of these guys who came from a family that 20 years earlier had been booted out.
So Irving is still I'm in my early stages of looking at it as a loyalist, but his father was exiled, and so he left with the family and went to London. And so his father, and probably him when he was young, ended up part of this loyalist club network in London. And then George Irving, ended up staying in Great Britain, but he kind of saw himself as an American, and he visited the U.S. at least once. I don't remember the details on that, so don't quote me on that one. But he really closely identified with his American heritage, and he tried to use the excuse that he was taken abroad as a young man. He didn't really have a choice to be a loyalist at that point. And so he became really close with the American government and ended up the consul for the Jefferson administration.
That's interesting. Now, the New England Club, I mean, because they're identifying themselves as New Englanders. And
at first.
At first. But that seems to be a thing I've seen in other people, even Thomas Hutchinson. They go to England and they realize that they're not really English. Is that something you've come across?
Oh, certainly. Yeah. They do make friends with some people in England, but there is a lot of a feeling of rejection. And especially for the more prominent loyalists who identified as loyalists at the very beginning, they expected to have gratitude from the British public and to be kind of, maybe not celebrities, but to be really appreciated as heroes. And then they get there and they're just kind of seen as, backwoods Americans that didn't do enough to keep America part of Great Britain. And so they're not really accepted into high British society. They might be accepted by some individual people, but they're not really getting that status that they wanted. And so they end up gravitating toward merchants in Britain, or more often toward other Americans that are exiled there.
It's interesting. Both they're seen as backwoods Americans, but on the other hand, they're seen as the ones who failed to keep their compatriots as part of the empire. And they also have this real dilemma they have, because many of them were among the elite in Massachusetts or wherever, but then they go to England and there the elite is much, much higher than their level had been here.
Yes. And I think that feeling of still wanting to be in that powerful position, but not being at all at the level of Great Britain was really dislocating for people like Thomas Hutchinson and some of the others too.
Yeah, it is. We're talking with Christina Carrick, who is an editor at the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, and also writing on the Loyalist networks, these Americans who remain loyal to the crown and are first banished. And some of them, she shows, do come back or maintain family connections with those who remain. You mentioned earlier that it was easier for women to hold on to property. And so can we talk a little bit more about the women they left behind when these guys go on their business trip to somewhere more receptive?
Well, so you see this in a lot of cases, actually. Almost every family that I looked at when I was doing my original research had female relatives that remained in Boston. And a lot of them were able to keep family property together, but the rules in Massachusetts, when they did allow confiscation of estates, they would often leave just the house in the immediate area around the house. for the woman who was living there, so that they didn't have to provide charity to her. But in some cases, like just having that person there helps protect the property from confiscation at all. And then you also have these women who are providing a lot of news and commentary for all of their relatives who are abroad. And so when they're thinking about coming back to New England, it's really a lot of the time these female relatives that are saying, you can come back, or don't come back, you might get hanged, or giving a different commentary on what the situation for them will be in terms of potential violence, or economic opportunities, or just general acceptance back into society. So they become really very important as a center to these news networks. And a lot of the time they kind of pass information along between different parts of the family that are exiled to different areas, especially families that ended up in Canada. You might have somebody send something from England that somehow makes it into Boston, and then they correspond with other relatives who are in Nova Scotia or New Brunswick, or vice versa. Or sometimes the other way around, they might correspond with Nova Scotia, and then that information is relayed into Massachusetts. So they provide a really fascinating and important role as hubs, and as like people who are able to hold things together when the men are kicked out.
Yeah. How did you get onto this topic, by the way? What led you to these networks as something to study?
Well, it's kind of a long path. So when I was initially in grad school, I was very fascinated by changing allegiances, like people who crossed back and forth over the lines. And somehow that got me interested in loyalties. And I remember very early in graduate school, I read Maya Jasanoff's book, Liberty of Exiles. And I was just fascinated by these loyalists and the diaspora they created. But then I started to wonder, like, did they go back, or did they keep a connection to New England? Because that's one part that she didn't include as much in that really interesting story. And so then I started looking at people who either went back or kept these tight connections to people in the United States in this sort of Atlantic world framework that was very important to look at the time. And so I really enjoy reading personal letters between people. And so I started going through their letters and cataloging where they were coming from, where they were going, and what they were talking about between these people in the Atlantic. So initially I had adopted a number of families that remained divided after the Revolution to see what they were talking about. But over the course of looking at that, I got interested again in people who did kind of use that as a tool to return. And that's how I ended up landing on David Greene. And in a way, I wanted him to continue feeling dislocated when he got back here to Boston, and to feel like he didn't belong anymore. But once I read through his letters, I realized that was not the case at all. That in fact, being in exile, he had found all these new opportunities, that when he returned to Boston, suddenly he was able to have even better opportunities than he'd had before he left. And so that kind of sent me down a new rabbit hole, research hole of these people who were able to benefit from that.
Interesting. Where are his papers and these letters that you were reading through?
So David Greene's papers are at the Clements Library in Michigan. They have his letter book. So there are some other letters of his in the Hubbard Green family papers in the Massachusetts Historical Society, but the main letter book is at the Clements Library. I also looked at like the Biles family, which some people might be familiar with, Mather Biles and his sisters. Mather Biles Sr., Mather Biles Jr., the two daughters, and the Quincy family, who are all held at the Massachusetts Historical Society too.
Just for those who don't know, can you fill us in on the Quincy's and the Bileses?
Well, the Quincy family was very interesting because, well, this will connect to one of my later topics, but Samuel Quincy was actually one of the prosecutors in the Boston Massacre trials with Robert Paine, who I ended up working on later on, while his brother, Josiah Quincy, was with John Adams on the other side.
And Josiah was the patriot.
But Samuel Quincy ended up being really forced in exile. And he ended up in London, but very bitter and very angry. His wife remained in Boston until several years after the war.
Did they ever reconcile? Did they ever get back together? He and his wife?
She actually joins him in Antigua. So after David Greene moved to Antigua, Samuel Quincy, who he was good friends with in London, ended up going down there too. And then his wife moves down, I believe, in 1785, but she only lives another 2 or 3 months after she was there before a Caribbean fever.
Oh my goodness!
Killed her.
Wow.
So they were not. So there are some families that I've looked at where the wives actually are politically opposed to their husband's loyalties. But in her case, I haven't seen any evidence of that. Just that she remained behind for logistical and their children stayed behind for quite a while.
Interesting. And you mentioned, of course, Robert Treat Paine, and I know you've done a lot of work on Robert Treat Paine, who is first Attorney General of Massachusetts. As you said, he is Samuel Quincy's co-prosecutor at the massacre trials and signer of the Declaration of Independence. So you're clearly looking at people on both sides of this whole issue. And so I wonder, what about Robert Treat Paine? I mean, what have you found out? Yeah, you call him one of the most forgotten of the founders.
Oh, well, Robert Treat Paine I kind of stumbled on by accident. I wasn't seeking him out as part of my loyalist research. I had the opportunity to get a job at the Massachusetts Historical Society as an assistant editor on the Paine papers for the last few volumes there. And it was after I started working on the Paine papers that I began to see more of these connections between him and various loyalists that I had looked at. But Paine is he's a fascinating guy, and his papers are especially fascinating. People do remember him a little bit as a signer of the Declaration of Independence, but he's not among the top list of people that are known for that. Because after he signed the Declaration, he went back to Massachusetts to take on that role of Attorney General. And he never left New England again after that. So he didn't take on as prominent of a role later in the Revolution or in the federal government that many of his compatriots did. But as Attorney General, he presided over quite a number of really important trials at that time. And his legal case notes, where he had little notebooks that he's filling with his own notes on different testimonies and trials, are part of the papers that they are working on at the society. And they are very interesting to get a snapshot at the lives of less prominent people in America at the time who were involved in all legal cases.
Right. Can you tell us about any of these cases that you found really interesting?
Well, a couple that are very famous would be like the Bathsheba Spooner murder trial. And I think sometime in the past you had somebody who worked on Bathsheba Spooner come onto this podcast. So that one was very interesting. And then he was the prosecutor in the Shays Rebellion treason trials. So you have a lot of firsthand accounts of every moment of those rebellions from the people involved and witnesses. And then there's another case that I found very interesting that was in the 1780s. I don't remember the exact year, but it was the case of these 3 free Black men who worked around Boston Harbor unloading ships and doing other jobs in the harbor, were abducted by, I guess, enslavers who lured them out under the pretense that they were going to unload a ship in the Boston Harbor, but then took them to the Caribbean and sold them into slavery. But Prince Hall, the head of the Boston Freemasons, and several Boston ministers, including Jeremy Belknap, one of the founders of the Massachusetts Historical Society, petitioned the governor to send letters to all of the governors of the Caribbean islands until several months later they were able to locate these men who had been sold and return them to Massachusetts. So the Robert Treat Paine role here is once they were returned, the men who abducted them were put on trial for kidnapping and found guilty. And I believe all 3 were sentenced to hard labor at Castle Island in Boston. But don't quote me on that part, but it's a very fascinating case.
That sounds like it, yeah.
Yeah.
And amazing the kind of forensic search they're having to do and writing letters to the governors. I mean, this is a time-consuming thing to actually do that and then get them to respond and keep a lookout for these 3 men who could have very easily just blended into the society.
So I find it amazing that they were actually able to find them and
Yeah.
bring them back to Boston, and they were able to testify at their own trials.
Wow.
With Robert Treat Paine sitting there taking notes.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, and I feel like that's not a case that very many people have talked about very much, even though it did connect directly to the banning of the slave trade in Massachusetts in particular.
Interesting. That's interesting. What's his handwriting like?
Terrible.
Really?
Well, while I was working there, I prided myself by saying I was one of maybe 2 people in the world that could read his handwriting in the journals. The original being the lead editor, Ed Hansen, who was the original lead editor of the Paine. When he had to write a nice letter to someone, it's somewhat legible, but in his legal case notes, it's extremely difficult to read. But I spent quite a lot of time with him and figured out some of his odd characters. And
wow. That's interesting.
It's fun to be able to figure that out.
So Ed Hansen's gone off to be a minister in England, and you've gone off to other things. So is there anyone remaining who can read his handwriting?
Oh, well, my mentor and boss at the Massachusetts Historical Society, Undine LeBlanc, learned some of his handwriting, though. Yeah. She often said, here, Christina, take this. Figure this page of journal out for me, please.
Yeah, I had a jarring experience when one of my best students was balking at reading handwriting of the people in the 18th and early 19th century. And so it's something we're losing by not being able to read cursive generally, but also you have someone like Paine who has difficult handwriting. It does take some deciphering to do so. I applaud you for doing this.
Well, it's with Paine, it's a little funny because sometimes even people at the time would respond to his letters saying, I couldn't quite read what you wrote there, but I think you were talking about this.
Wow.
So even by the standards of the time, he had very challenging handwriting. But I share your concerns about future generations being able to read a lot of these original resources.
Yeah. What about does he do anything other than be Attorney General? Not that that's an insignificant thing, but you mentioned he doesn't serve in the federal government, so he stays at home. Does he run for governor or do other things? How long was he Attorney General?
He was Attorney General from the end of 1777 through 1789, I believe. So I might be slightly off on that. And then 1790, if I remember correctly, he joined the Supreme Judicial Court for Massachusetts.
Okay.
And he served as a justice there for the next 14 years. Until he retired, largely due to deafness. People were complaining that he could no longer hear the witness testimonies, and so they encouraged him to retire.
Well, that would be a problem if you're a judge. So, yeah, we're talking with Christina Carrick, assistant editor at the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, formerly one of the editors at the Papers of Robert Treat Paine, working on a book about the Loyalist networks in post-revolutionary America and in Britain and the greater Atlantic world. So now you're at work at Princeton on the Papers of Thomas Jefferson. And really, what period are you focusing on with Jefferson?
Right now, we are working primarily through 1806 and 1807. So with Thomas Jefferson, of course, so Robert Treat Paine, we had a total of 5 volumes of published papers. Thomas Jefferson, we're working on volume 54.
Yeah.
And we have more to go. And his retirement series papers are down at Monticello. So anything after he retired from the presidency is being published by them. So total, we'll be looking at 85 volumes of Thomas Jefferson's papers compared to 5 of other series. Yeah. And so each volume for us might cover up 3 months of Jefferson's presidency. So in the 6 years I've been there, we've covered late 1805 through mid 1807. So 6 years for me, only 2 years for Jefferson.
Yeah. And of course, this papers project began before you were born in the early 1950s, I believe, when the United States started this enterprise of publishing these founding documents. So you're kind of, for you, this is like 6 years of work, but it's part of a much bigger, longer project that I don't know if in our lifetimes we'll see the end of it.
Oh, well, Julian Boyd started the project in 1944. He was the librarian of Princeton University at the time. And so I think it was 1950 before they were able to get the first volume out. But yes, we're 81 years now working through this project with a whole team of editors. But one of the wonderful things about the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, compared to earlier volumes of his writings that have already been published, is that he, for one, kept everything, or almost everything. And so we are publishing virtually everything. And so while he was president, he received a lot of letters from people all over the country, all over the world, really. And so we are making an attempt to publish all of those. And that it really helps get the voices of underrepresented people into the papers collection, because he did keep everything. He didn't respond, but he did record it in his book of received letters, filed these things away.
Interesting. So you're not just publishing things Jefferson wrote, but things people wrote to Jefferson.
Yes. Letters to the president.
That could be a whole series.
Well, it's been the last, let's see, how many volumes of Jefferson papers? At least 10. More than that.
So what kinds of things are people writing to him about?
Oh, well, recently I had a man from rural Maine who wrote a very long letter describing conditions in rural Maine and asking for a post office. I also recently had a Presbyterian minister named Gideon Blackburn who established a school in like the North Carolina-Tennessee border, modern border, for Cherokee children in the early 1800s. And so he had the students at that school write letters to the president discussing their education at that school. So we are now publishing the letters of these children who are at that school. And then, of course, you have, major correspondence like the Marquis de Lafayette writing to him from Europe, talking about things going on there, or very, in 1806, 1807, we're working through the Aaron Burr papers. So many accounts of different, either first rumors of what's going on in the with what Aaron Burr is up to, and then later on papers related to his trial when he was tried for treason in 1805. So
That's
a very wide array of things.
So you have both kind of the big issues, but then the smaller ones, like the Reverend Blackburn and someone in Maine wanting a post office, and fascinating range of things that are coming across Jefferson's desk, and then through the Jefferson tape, across yours too.
Oh, and then we have things like letters from his granddaughter talking about the chickens they're raising. So it really is like a fascinating array of snapshots into the early American Republic.
Now, what has changed about your perceptions of Jefferson as you've had this now 6-year deep dive into his presidency?
I'm not really sure that I would say much in my perception has necessarily changed, except that I've gained respect for how much he kept things. But for me, the real joy of working on the Jefferson papers is to see all the stories from these other people that are writing to him, just to get a glimpse into life for all of these different people, or what issues they are seeing as important enough to them to write to the president about them. And so for me, it's fascinating to be able to research and in a way get to know like all kinds of people from that era, not just Jefferson himself.
That's true. It really is a window. As you mentioned, going down rabbit holes, and this gives you any number of new ones to look into as these correspondence with Jefferson. We're talking with Christina Carrick, who is an assistant editor at the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, working through the presidential papers, actually his second term. You've also written about his second inaugural address. His first inaugural address, of course, is one of the great touchstones. It sets the tone for actually the next half century or so of American politics. What can you tell us about his second inaugural address as a statement?
Well, a lot of my research on the second inaugural has actually been on Jefferson's ability to present. So I wish I had the image in front of me, but the fascinating thing there is actually the physical relic that he left behind. So for his second inaugural address, he didn't think that he presented his first one all that well, because Jefferson was renowned as, well, Jefferson was known as not being a particularly good public speaker.
Well, he knew he wasn't a good public speaker,
Yeah.
too. Yeah.
No, so he put a lot of effort into the second inaugural, and he was able to abbreviate the entire address onto the front and back of one sheet of paper. And then throughout the thing, he put these little markings like hash marks and circles and other elocution marks onto the document, trying to indicate to himself where he should pause or where he should add emphasis onto different words. I think to try to help him present the address better and more understandably than he did his previous address. Unfortunately, despite all of that work that he put into it, everyone who was at the inaugural address commented that he was not audible at all.
Wow. In an era before microphones and other things, and the first inaugural address is really a tremendously eloquent statement of everything. And but yeah, you can imagine if no one can hear it, it's not going to have the same impact.
He did immediately send it off to be published.
Right.
So most people around the country would be reading both in newspapers in printed form anyway. But no, the eloquence of the spoken word would not have really come through. Yeah. And the second address is eloquent in a way too. It doesn't have quite the same quotable passages that you see in the first inaugural.
Well, the one great one is, what farmer, what mechanic, what artisan ever sees the face of a tax gatherer of the United States?
Well, and he says, we are all Federalists. We are all
Republicans. Yeah, in the first one. Yeah. So what do we have to look forward to in the next volume of Jefferson's Papers?
Well, so we're usually working on like 4 at a time that are going through different parts of the review process. But volume 49, which will be coming out at the end of this year, has, the beginnings of the Aaron Burr.
Okay.
And then the one we're working on right now, volume 54, which will be a few years before it comes out, we're starting to look at the Chesapeake Leopard affair.
Oh, wow. Okay.
From all over the country, with their strong desire to defend the United States against British aggression, and a lot of militia companies volunteering for service should they be needed. So that's the big theme of the volume 54 that we're working on right now. One thing that I work on in particular that's spread throughout the volumes is petitions for pardon to the president, which are really interesting, especially at that point in time, because in Washington, D.C., every crime was essentially a federal crime. And so you have people who are imprisoned with a fine, but they don't have any way to pay the fine. So the only way to get out of prison is to write a letter to the president and ask for a pardon.
Wow.
So those are really fascinating to me, and there are a few of those in all of the volumes that we're looking at.
It's interesting. Yeah. I know John Quincy Adams is president. In his diary, he mentions the people who come to him because they need a handout or something. So he's...
Jefferson mentions those. Well, we do get a lot of letters asking for charitable contributions that he saved. People with stories of hardship, or people just asking for, support to get their business up and running, that are really interesting. And then you can see when they actually visited him, because he'll record in his memorandum books when he gave a charitable donation to different people. Yeah.
Do you get a sense, is there a difference between when Jefferson is in Washington and when he's at Monticello? Because he said at one point in Monticello, he feels like a workhorse, just constantly churning, because he's constantly writing. It seems he says he does more writing there than he does in Washington.
Yes, for sure, especially to his cabinet members. When he's in Washington, they have meetings with Gallatin and with Madison, and his other secretaries. But when he's at Monticello, he has to do all of that by letters. So it's nice for us because we get a little bit more of detail into how they're interacting with each other as parts of the cabinet, but it must have been a lot more work for him because he did have to constantly be writing to them, especially if he was at Monticello when there was a big dramatic world event.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It does give you an appreciation, though, of the speed of communication and how long it took, a letter to go from, say, Madison in Washington to Jefferson, or when Madison was at Montpelier or Gallatin was in Washington. I mean, the way they would have had to connect with each other through writing, it's not an easy thing.
No, but it's speedy for the time. I mean, you can turn around in a couple of days for a lot of those letters. So they expected pretty rapid responses for that.
Yeah, that's good. So we've been talking with Christina Carrick, who is an assistant editor of the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, and she served as an editor on volumes 45, 46, 47, 40, and then 48 through 53, I guess, are in the works. And also you've been an editor of the Papers of Robert Paine, published by the Mass Historical Society, and working on the Loyalist networks. Christina, I mean, we've covered a lot of ground, from the Loyalists, time of the Revolution, to the Jefferson administration. Is there anything else we should talk about?
No, goodness. I do feel like I wear many hats when I'm researching, but they are all connected in ways. Especially, we mentioned earlier with George Irving and the Jefferson consuls abroad. It's nice that I can kind of come full circle to having people who are connected to these exiled Loyalists now serving the Jefferson administration. So I feel like in a way, my research and my career is coming full circle by connecting those two.
That's great.
Is there anything else you would like to?
Well, I wonder if you have any advice to anyone who wanted to get into documentary editing.
Well, first, I would recommend that you visit the Association for Documentary Editing website, which, not to be confused with the the Alliance for Documentary Editors, which is movies. And you can see the variety of different projects that we have, that the different allied projects are going on. Documentary editing is by nature a very collaborative enterprise. And so we interact with each other across projects quite often, share research and share resources that we're using. And it's really great to work with all of these other editors on projects around the country that connect to ours. Now, I would say if anyone wants to be a documentary editor, start volunteering to transcribe and reading those original sources, because practice with handwriting is most essential.
Yes.
And really getting to know each person that we're working on, and the nuances and little different elements of their handwriting that might help you to read in particular. And then also we have the opportunity to do like really in-depth research on individual people within these papers that I think, when they might be mentioned in broader monographs, might not get that same, like, we try to identify every person who wrote to or received a letter from Thomas Jefferson.
Wow.
And I hope that can be of use in adding these people to the historical record, and in helping people who are writing the monographs that often use our editions. And so
that's great.
I'm very happy to be working in documentary editing, and
that's good.
I would encourage other scholars to look into it.
Great. Well, what you do is really invaluable to the scholarly world and the general public. I mean, a lot has been digitized and then put on the Founders Online source. The National Archives, I know, has a project. They're looking for civilian volunteers to transcribe things. And here in Boston, the Congregational Library has a big project on the hidden histories of New England. They're looking for people to help transcribing a lot of great church records. And so there are really many great opportunities for people who want to get into this, and learn this handwriting.
The American Philosophical Society, I know, is doing a Transcribing the Revolutionary City project that is also bringing in, citizen transcribers to help with this work. And I'm sure there are others out there too. But
it's really great. It's great to hear that it's a collaborative enterprise too. That because you're doing Jefferson. I mean, you're not the anti-Hamiltons, but you're all working together to just trying to figure out what happened.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Christina. We've been talking with Christina Carrick, who is an assistant editor at the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, and as she said, wears many other hats in the world of scholarship. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our tireless executive director of Revolution 250, and also thank our listeners who tune in regularly. Every week we thank some, and if you're in one of these places, send Jonathan an email, jlane@revolution250.org, and he'll send you some Revolution 250 swag. And if you just want to connect with us, send us an email. We love hearing from people. And this week, I want to thank our listeners in the great city of Philadelphia, and here in the Bay State at East Falmouth on Cape Cod, Casa Grande, Arizona, Las Cruces, New Mexico, Edinburgh in Scotland, Burlington in Vermont, Katy, Texas, home of a great pitcher, Goffstown in New Hampshire, Acapulco in Mexico, and Kelvin Grove, Australia, and all places between and beyond. Thanks for joining us, and now we'll be piped out on the road to Boston.